Stay tuned for part 2 of this conversation. And we are live. My name's Dave Holder. With me, I've got Ryan Rambo. What's up, brother?
Nothing much, Dave. It's been a while, but we've been improving things. So hopefully, all the hard work is going to pay off. It's going to come across great, look nice, be more appealing for our audience. So, like to start off by thanking our audience for the donations and being patient with us as we've upgraded everything. And looking forward to getting back into the regular conversations and meeting some interesting people and sharing some great stories.
It has been a minute. I keep forgetting that it's been a couple of months probably. I think we've put out 2 episodes this summer as we've been retooling, but also surviving the pace of family and work and all of that. So thanks for your patience, everybody. We did promise you it would be well worth the wait. An old friend of mine, Matthew Hedger, gave me a ring, and I hadn't heard from him in probably close to 15 years, something like that. And we have got him on the show today, and this is his first time being able to speak in a public setting since he came out of a special program in which he's been for over a decade now. So, hey, welcome to the studio. Welcome to UnIntelligence, Matthew. It is
Thank you.
an honor to have you here, man.
It's a pleasure. I've really been looking forward to talking with you guys and doing this.
Heck yeah. Hey, cheers. We made it. We're here. You're here, safe and in one piece. Just glad to have you, brother. We're talking about counterintelligence on this show, man. And you've seen a lot of stuff other than traditional counterintelligence, but at the end of the day, I get the impression you might know a little more about it than your everyday practitioner.
I mean, maybe from a different angle, at least. Being exposed to it, from the FCA world in the beginning, and then being the person that other countries' CI was looking for for a long time. Different perspective for sure.
So when you say FCA, is that where you started?
No, so I originally joined the Navy. I wanted to do something in intelligence, and I talked to one of the recruiters, and they said, this thing CTR, which is like a SIGINT collector. They're like, yeah, this is intelligence collection, and I thought it was like a human style thing at the time. Didn't know what it was, and went for that. So I was kind of sold a bag of goods uh, in the beginning. I went to Corey Station, the Naval Center for Information Dominance, after boot camp for the training on that, and realized it was on the tech side instead of the people side pretty quick. And then I was selected out of there by the NSA to come do a civilian NSA billet. And so I think I'm the worst sailor in history. I've never even taken a tour of a ship. I spent a few months doing the Navy thing, and then the NSA pulled me over. So I went to work initially in a ComSec monitoring shop, which was listening to people overseas calling back home or emailing back home, and monitoring that traffic to see if they were disclosing classified information. Listening to a lot of phone sex, during that time. um, but it was valuable because I got to understand, based on what the NSA was looking for, what the adversary collection requirements were. Um, it was pretty broad, and being 19, exposed to essentially, here's everything we want to safeguard. So that was a really unique learning opportunity. But I didn't want to stay there, so I asked the SES at the time if I could deploy, and ended up in Afghanistan, which is where we met right after that. Um,
All right, so you joined as your early days in the Navy then were, I mean, basically we could think of it in terms of of signals monitoring, but you were kind of doing it for internal operational security in the beginning until you got downrange, right?
Right. So that shifted. Originally, it was just that. Are our forward deployed saying things they're not supposed to over the phone? And then the pre-training to deploy was mostly, like a JSOC based targeting, SIG targeting kind of thing. Um, and that was mostly aimed at like HVTs and stuff like that. And it wasn't until you and I interacted that I even saw the counterintelligence side to it at all. It was mostly just looking for people on their list.
Well, I didn't fully understand the reason for that at the time, but you were there in a different capacity than all the other traditional signals intelligence or SIG analysts. I didn't know that actually until a couple weeks ago when we finally reconnected. Tell us a little bit about your capacity there in Afghanistan and how that was different.
Sure. So a lot of people were, attached to the combatant component over there. So like I think it was the 101st at the time, and they were from, I believe it was the Special Troops Battalion from the 101st, and so they were very much there to support the 101st mission. Um, I was on a lone deployment, from the NSA, and so I didn't really report to that system. My boss was back in the United States, or we would work with the chief of base over there. But mostly, like I said, the HVT thing, and so we were doing geospatial targeting as well, right? So we're looking for who the phone numbers are connected to and where they're physically at, trying to track people down. And as you guys already know, you have the tiers to it, right? You got somebody that's already a task selector, and then let's see who they're calling, who's in their world. And when those people are physically located on U.S. military bases, it was confusing at first, to be honest. It's like, why, we're looking to go track these people down, but they're already here. Or are they like using their phone in the prison somewhere? Or the traditional thing when you're trying to track these HVTs down is, you know, pinning down like a bed down location, where these guys are going to be at. We can, show up and ruin their evening. But when the connections to the target are sitting on a U.S. military base, geospatially, it was confusing at first. I thought maybe they still had their phone on them and we had already rolled them up or something like that. But it turned out to be those interpreters that were, had these connections to tasked, Al Qaeda contacts and even intelligence officers from Iran. And so, from our perspective, if you're a U.S. interpreter, right, like a hired interpreter, and you're making phone calls to somebody that we know is an MOIS officer, there's probably no decent excuse for that. So that's what was alerting at the time.
Well, so I'd heard rumblings that we had a U.S. interpreter or two or three that had come under investigation, like a formal counterintelligence investigation for something like that. But what I hadn't considered is the possibility that Afghan nationals could be doing the same thing. I had this assumption that down at a small combat base like the one south of Kabul in
Yeah.
Wardak province, um, that the local employees were just that. They were locals from the area that needed work. They were doing construction, taking care of delivering water and different things to the base, taking the trash out, um, and local interpreters. And so when I went out, it was one of my first tactical counterintelligence support operations off of Bagram, and I went down there with the team and we did some screening and stuff, and we started getting indicators that there were signals emanations coming off the base right around the time that troops were leaving the base or coming back on. And So before I put two and two together, that was concerning. And I was only down there 10 days, but during that time, I know that my partners, Ben and Mike and Scott and a couple others, Pat, were working with you to figure out, is this a problem?
Mhm.
Can we correlate this with something that makes sense from a counterintelligence perspective? Right. And it was tough. I mean, even at the end of that 10 days when we had to leave for another mission, we still didn't have clarity, partially because we couldn't communicate top secret information over the wire with headquarters. So you couldn't tell us exactly what was happening. Um, but, out of that operation, I think it was largely your work in defining a threat signature that could be replicated. Tell us a little bit about that and how that changed the course of where you went in your career.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as the signature, it was just obvious that these people had no idea the pattern that can be created, subconsciously with a phone. Um, and the closer, like you said, the timeline matched up with convoy movements and stuff like that. And so, these are assets for somebody else. They're not trained intelligence officers, and so
Right.
they're just too close to the moment. Right? It becomes too obvious. There's not time and distance between their messaging and the reaction to it. Um, and so that became a bigger deal than I thought it was at the time. I didn't know what you were doing or what the case wrapped up with. But when I got home, uh, back to where I was stationed at, I was pulled into the SES's office, which is a flag level officer at the NSA. And he said, "Hey, there were some innovative things about how SIGINT worked with CI on this, and I'd like you to go talk to this other unit that's down the street." And that happened to be the FCA, the Foreign Counterintelligence Activity. And so I was the first person the NSA ever put over there. There was a shop back at headquarters that they could send an RFI to and ask for SIGINT support.
Right.
I was the first person to go over there on a permanent, sitting with those guys. And so everybody else is a badge and credentialed CI officer,
Mm-hmm.
agent at the time, except for me. And so, we obviously can't go into what the mission of that organization was for classification reasons, but, it was the tip of the spear for counterintelligence.
For sure.
And there were so many very experienced multi-decade people working there, and I got to get a master's class in espionage from these people, from the perspective of the people that mess with spies in other places. And
Mm-hmm.
that became, I think it was the best education I could have gotten for what came next, sitting there with so many of those people.
I was just wondering how many deployments, how long did you get a chance to take after class?
It was just the one, and it was 6 months.
Okay.
That was it. Um, and as
And,
soon
and
as I got back,
what time frame was that?
this is 2008, the end of
2000.
2008.
All right,
Mhm.
perfect.
Yeah. And so as soon as I got
So,
back, I spent the rest of the tour down there with FCA. Yeah.
gotcha. So you said something about your tour in Afghanistan that was interesting. You said it was almost easy to detect the signature, right? Once you knew where to look. Um,
Mhm.
it was just correlation of activities. And when Ethier and I were teamed up doing a scrub of all the last, say, 3 or 4 years of human reporting to look for trends that um,
Mhm.
had some kind of counterintelligence nexus, um, what we found was that the reporting was generally there, and it was quite easy to get a threat picture of what was happening on U.S. bases. There were explicit reports of people being on coalition bases and U.S. bases throughout the eastern half of the country that we were responsible for, who were cooperating with various insurgent elements. including Al Qaeda and others. And nobody had really been reading those because they weren't tagged with the types of meta tags that are supposed to go into reports that cue off on different elements. And so a lot of little technical things had to be fixed, and we got those things fixed for the future. But at the end of the day, we also found it quite easy to use that SIGINT threat signature and replicate it in all of our future operations. Were much more successful than that first one. But the first one really set the tone for an entire year of counterintelligence support to combat troops downrange. And that was because we got our heads together, and you weren't there to support our team. So, like, what was it exactly that you were prepped and ready to do in Afghanistan? And what caught your attention about the way our little ragtag CI team was doing stuff in Afghanistan? What was different about what you expected and what you found, and how did that affect your choices going forward?
I don't want to be condescending to the system, but what I expected was this. And so I just turned 20 when I was on this deployment. And what I expected was this flawless system where it was some movie, where they just had everything under control. And to see that simple processes of passing information out to a combatant commander, like we couldn't achieve it somehow,
Yeah.
was what was shocking. Or the idea that we're so special, all the information we collect, we can't tell anybody, which kind of defeats the purpose of collecting the information in the first place. And so I didn't really expect that those hurdles were there. I thought it was, man, you find a problem, you pick up the bat phone, you tell somebody it's there, and, groovy, but it wasn't like that for sure.
There's no bat phone,
No.
and you ended up you were there not to support the Army. Like, you were there and you were trained to support special operations. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. A special mission unit that was out there at the time. Yeah.
At 20 years old. I mean, isn't it shocking the responsibility that our military places on young people? I mean, you couldn't even buy an alcoholic beverage in the United States, but here you are downrange, doing the NSA mission, supporting SMUs, and doing high-level counterintelligence. I mean, so one, it's a hat tip to you because somebody saw the potential and saw the character and trusted you enough to put you in that position. But it's an extraordinary story to hear someone at such a young age to do that type of mission. And I think it happens more often than people really believe or understand.
You constantly, yeah, you're right. And there were a lot of people that were out there that were my age around me. I wasn't an exception at the time. And even later, when I did the operational side of the house, doing the commercial cover stuff, we often use the youngest people to do these things, obviously, because foreign intelligence services essentially haven't made book on you yet. They don't know who you are. And so the responsibility and the trust was something I took very seriously. And we could task numbers over there, right? So I was able to say through the computer, I think this person's, no good. I didn't have to ask. And if I said so, they got some really negative attention from the U.S. Bigger system. And so, it's a job like we talked about before this. You have to be a serious-minded person to do this. And it's a lot of responsibility we put on our younger people.
We joke around a lot on this show, but when you say it takes a serious-minded person to do this kind of work, it cannot be underemphasized. I heard it again with prepping for our interview with Jack Barsky, who is a retired KGB spy here in America from East Germany. And it's one thing that surfaced in one of his previous interviews is that when people are making a decision to engage in things that are of this level of consequence, you need to know that that your boss and the system is okay with what you're doing. They've got your back. Um, they have your best interest in mind. They're not making flippant decisions that are going to cause unnecessary trauma for anyone, including the targets and the people around them. And all these things kind of have to come into place. And, I remember some of my first interactions with leadership in Afghanistan after that first operation that you and I worked together. And, it was challenging because we had worked hard for probably 3 or 4 months to put that operation together, executed it. It was successful. But then at the end of the operation, I found out there was a detainee abuse scandal.
Mhm.
The 9 spies that collectively we found as a part of our operation were arrested by the combat commander there. His name was Roger Hill, and for our audience, you'll be hearing from Roger Hill shortly. We're looking forward to having him on the show. Um, and that was when he arrested those insider threats. It was during one of the biggest combat operations in the history of the U.S. Presence in Afghanistan. It was the second largest combat operation since Operation Anaconda, just after 9/11. So there was a lot happening and a lot at stake. And he was able to obtain the kind of real time information that saved lives. But unfortunately, later it turned out they roughed up a couple of the detainees a little bit, and that's discouraged. It's illegal. They got in trouble, and that kind of colored my experience. Coming back, thinking we did it, we found a system that we can replicate at different bases to protect combat commanders, and it turned out like this. And it was my boss's boss, and then Brigadier General Mark Milley, that decided we're going to take the lessons learned from this and figure out how to do it better. And I was impressed enough that I decided to reenlist. I wasn't going to because of the criminal investigations, the Army CID investigation that happened afterwards, and all the craziness that happened with that. But I was impressed enough that there were serious-minded people doing counterintelligence work and interested in supporting the warfighter, that it was worth continuing, and so was Ethier. My friends Ben and Scott and Pat and others, we decided to stay in the fight. Um, at that time, did you know there was a controversy at that first Wardak operation?
No, not at all. So I didn't even know
Ah,
about that
okay.
until we reconnected like a month ago. Um, the book,
Oh, so when you read the book Dog Company, that was your first time
right?
knowing about the. Oh, okay.
That was it.
Shit.
I had no idea that there was a controversy over it. No idea there was a trial. I assumed that when I left after we passed this off, a bunch of people went and arrested those guys, and it went, like a movie would go. I didn't know until
Oh
reconnecting
no.
with you. What I mean, 15 years later, that's not
Yeah.
what happened.
But you went on and got picked up to go work at FCA as a young uh, Navy person, NSA person in the Navy, right? This is just the rarest combination. Like that's a special type of assignment. Where'd you go next?
Yeah, they've made it up just for that. That was the. I don't know if they've even replaced NSA billet with FCA. Well, it's not FCA anymore, but I don't know if they continued it after I was gone. But when my tour finished, I was approached about a special program with CIA at that point and onboarded with them, which was entirely a commercial cover uh, program, which I did for a little over a decade, which turned into using criminal cover as well to enhance the bona fides for what we were trying to achieve. Our basic mission when I was there was two parts. One was the covert finance piece. That was, essentially the best way to think of that is we're taking U.S. money and we want to essentially launder it to use it overseas, so the people that we're using it with don't know that Uncle Sam wrote the original paycheck. And that can be to pay people in places, that can be to buy stuff that we don't want a U.S. government flavor to. And then the second part that we did was the hard target acquisition stuff, the procurement. And that would be for hard tech, comms gear, things like that from countries that are adversarial to us. Some of that's black market stuff. Some of it's using somebody inside the system to get. And so that was kind of those two things. And because we were using criminal cover to support this, I ended up oddly in this long-term infiltration with an international organized crime group that lasted over 3 years. I was a part of that group. So
You covered a lot of ground in like 30 seconds there. It seems so implausible that a SIGINTer would end up running an operation like you were running, and the types of concepts you threw out would usually take a person an entire career to do one of them, and you did a bunch of them. How does a guy like you end up there? Like, what was the process? You went to FCA, you sat at the feet of giants, and you supported their operations and learned. How did you end up? How did you learn how to take what you had done so far and transition that into supporting this incredible type of operation? Like, did you have to go back to college? What was the process?
I did go back to college. I had to do a focus on finance so that I could do the money side.
Gotcha.
So there was a collegiate education part. What was so valuable that I think made our stuff a little effective was the CI exposure from before. I had a very unique view about how the best people in the world catch who I was about to become. And so,
Wow.
from the
Okay.
NSA side, from using the phone, from the electronics, and from these extremely world class counterintelligence officers. And so the transition was, I don't want to say easy, but in the way of don't do that stuff when you're out there over here, because that's how you get caught. And so I took a lot of those lessons with me. And I think that was a large part of why I was able to be successful in my new role.
So when you went back to college, what was involved with that?
So I was doing that essentially in my copious free time uh, while still working and training. My training, I can't get into all the details of the agency training, but I had a mentor who was just a legend, um, that passed on a lot to me in 101 training. And I also had specialists that were brought in that I was the only student at the time for. And these are people that are top 1% in the world at what they do specifically. And that was the coolest part for me, was getting to learn all these different things from just the all-star team, the best in the world at it. I mean, it'd be like having Michael Jordan as your personal, basketball coach. So that was maybe the coolest part, was the very one-on-one attention training.
Well, I would imagine you would have to start building your legend at some point. Like assuming the persona, living that life. And is that day one when you made the transition over and you committed into that role? You said, okay, here it is. I've got to start being that guy. Um, just talk us through that. I think that's pretty interesting for people to know.
You're absolutely right. The persona was the first thing. Um, my intent before I had met Dave was I was probably going to go the SMU route, try to be an operator when I left. And it was that CI op that opened my eyes, and I thought maybe I'm more suitable to do something different than being a trigger puller. And the first thing I was told by my mentor, the person training me, was he's like, "You reek of being in the military." I was like, "I'm not even in the military." I was. He's like, "But we got to lose that." Um, and we started building the persona. I didn't come. A lot of people that work in like a non-official cover capacity come from uh, a higher class world. Usually, you don't have to teach them. I came from an extremely poor background, and so I had to learn a lot of the finer graces as well at the same time. And my mentor had done a lot of work with organized crime in the past. He was in South America with Noriega. He had done some Russian organized crime stuff. And so one of the biggest things I had to learn was when you're building a cover persona to not, or if you're even using true name and it's just a persona, not try to make a perfect person um, that everybody's going to like. And especially when you're going into that world, there's unlikable qualities about people in that. And it's okay to have those too. And you have to do that on purpose instead of trying to make this fairy tale, super likable person that's not genuine. It's easy to see through that because those people don't exist. And I think that's something that people make mistakes on quite often when they build a cover platform. Is they make who they want to be instead of who they need to be.
For sure. I mean, because people that are, you know, Captain America, yeah, don't typically do the nefarious things that happen in the underworld of espionage or organized crime, that sort of thing. So it has to be believable. And having been in that world at times too, I mean, it's an interesting thing building out the legend, the persona, and making it believable. And then also being able to talk to it. If you say you have a finance background and have no idea about finance, it shows up immediately.
As you guys know really well, if you're going to bring something into the room, you better be able to speak to it. And you don't know who's in the room, right? So if you're going to pretend to be a brain surgeon, you might be sitting next to one, and it's not explaining brain surgery to some random person. It could be somebody that knows exactly what they're talking about, and so you never want to introduce something that isn't backstopped and that you can't speak to at the level you say you know it, or things get pretty dangerous quickly.
So how'd you get your finance background? How did that work?
So before I joined, I was going to college before, and I worked at a bank before I joined. I actually started working at a bank when I was 16 back
Interesting.
home, and so I knew a little bit about banking. But I also, while I was going through this, went to King's College London to get a master's in finance, to so that I could speak to it at that level. And essentially because most of what I was doing was, the covert finance and laundering money. It's not just to pretend and convince somebody you're in that world. I was trusted with 8 figures at a time of money from the U.S. government.
Hmm.
You don't want to mess that up. It's a lot of responsibility. And so when I started that, I was still in my 20s, and now I'm,
When you started the
moving.
master's program?
Well, and this line of work. Um,
Yeah, so you were in commercial cover then after your FCA time, your foreign counterintelligence activity.
mhm,
Um, you moved over into basically a knock role, commercial cover knock role. Then you got involved with King's College to get your finance education going while you're kind of also doing this other training with international specialists on various topics you needed to get smart on.
mhm.
And then you had
I was
about,
also
sounds like you,
shadowing. I was shadowing my mentor who was doing this work at the same time. And so I
Gotcha.
was in the room, watching this happen while I was training.
Perfect. And you ended up doing that kind of commercial cover as a finance expert for about a decade, right?
About 13 years.
13 years.
Mhm.
And it was about a decade, though, prior to joining, to kind of converting into the criminal cover side of things, in which you were still the same persona and still a finance expert, right?
Mhm.
But it seems like there was there was a difference based on previous conversation we had earlier last week. How did that work out?
Well, so the criminal cover thing was very light in the beginning, um, just to project that persona with people that we were working with. And then one of the things that happened was a foreign service was trying to essentially determine if we were legitimate, if I was legitimate. And so what they did is they called up, and we knew this from SIG support, that they called up a private investigator. They had a woman call up and say, "Hey, I'm dating this guy, and I think he's stepping out on me. Can you follow him around?" And so I was essentially getting low level surveillance from this PI. And so the plan we came up with was to reinforce the criminal bona fides by hanging out in places that these people do. And so we got a list from a law enforcement side of the house that said, here's where all these organized crime people hang out. And so I would just, when I wasn't on assignment, I would hang in these places and still doing contact reports with the people that I was engaging with there. And one day I get a signal from my boss, we need to meet. I go talk to him and he says, "Hey, one of the guys you've been writing reports about is a like super, super high ranking figure in this international organized crime group." And I had no idea. And he said, "People have been trying to get close to this guy for a very long time. They've been unsuccessful. Um, they want to know if you'd be willing to do this intentionally going forward." And so we worked with, well, not we, but my boss worked with a lot of lawyers, and we got the right authorities to let this happen. And I essentially took a run at that group. Now, my tasking wasn't to collect criminal evidence against these people. It was if I made it in, my criminal bona fides would be through the roof. There would just be
Right.
no way that a foreign service thought I was affiliated with the US government if I was a made man in this thing. And so that was the goal, was to use them as a shade essentially for the work I was already doing.
You're having this conversation with us today to the public, the global public, and I've talked to a couple of people in very vague terms about our upcoming interview, and their first question is always, "Are you concerned about safety for your
Mm.
friend?" And how would you address that question? Because I know that's what our listeners are going to think.
Well, I mean, a few points to that. One, what we do is inherently dangerous anyway. Um, I'm not flippant about my safety, but I also don't think that we should be more afraid of them than they are of us.
Fair enough.
And I'm also not directly saying who they are out of respect, because that's a line in that world. You use somebody's name, you use the organization's name directly. It's a much bigger deal than talking in umbrella terms about them. And so it's not really a concern. I also, like I said, I wasn't there to exploit them for criminal evidence. I didn't
Yeah.
testify against anybody. Nobody went to prison because of me. Um,
Yeah.
and so a lot of those people being U.S. citizens, it's possible that they think they contributed to a patriotic cause, you know. But
In what way?
They help build your
Oh,
street cred. I mean,
exactly.
you got cred because of them.
Right, right. Because of my affiliation with them, I was able to go do aggressive things against the enemies of this country. And so, in a way, they unwittingly participated in helping with that.
All right, so your target had nothing to do with domestic criminal groups or even regional criminal groups. It had to do with foreign intelligence agencies up against the U.S.
Correct. That was my target. The
Gotcha.
criminal group was founded in the United States. It was a one percenter motorcycle club, and also had connections with a Mexican drug trafficking organization as well, which is the biggest bona fides you can get in the criminal world. That's the top dog in that game. And so, for people who don't know, the outlaw motorcycle world is structured very similar to the special operations community, where you have like a tier 3 kind of thing, which you would call like a two-piece patch club. Um, and then you have an outlaw club that's a three-piece patch, which is basically the club name is the top rocker, the center is the club logo, and the bottom is the territory. And then at the top of that world is similar to a special mission unit, the one percenters, which, on the front of their vest wear the one percenter logo. And most of these clubs were made by vets, is how they all started. And so they have a very military style structure. And the club that I was a part of was one of the big four. And so they were the top dog. There are thousands of members worldwide, and extremely respected in that world by everybody.
When you say one percenters, can you give us a little context? Like, where did that come
Well,
from?
so the term one percenter came from the Hollister riots way back in the day when this started. And some motorcycle club guys got into a brawl, in Hollister, California. And after this, Harley Davidson wrote, I believe is in Reader's Digest, that in this like marketing campaign to save their image, don't worry, 99% of people who ride Harley Davidsons are law abiding citizens. And so
Okay,
these people took it as a badge of honor to say, yeah, but we're the 1%
I
that
love it.
isn't.
Okay, so if you see somebody wearing 1% on their vest, what would the common person need to understand about that, if anything?
I think the common person would need to understand that the biggest word in their world is respect. Um, if you disrespect them, they're going to react in a way that they see as regaining that respect off of you. If you're respectful to them, they can be the nicest people in the world. Um, I've watched, people I would say was a mentor to me, when I joined that world. Um, Explain things to people, let drunk people ask them really pointed questions, as long as it's being respectful. Um, as soon as it's not, it's a very different story, because that's all they have over there. Their world gets they deter aggression by not accepting disrespect, and they're very public
Yeah.
about their brand image is we don't let people disrespect us.
Well, you mentioned that of the one percenters, a lot of them were started by vets. Um, what is the composition like?
I think it's waned quite a bit recently. In
Huh.
modern times, a lot of the composition, just to get numbers and compete, they've ingested a lot of Latin street gangs, kind of bumped them
Gotcha.
up into that world just to get numbers. There's one club specifically from California that grew very quickly because they took that in, and that also gives them a narcotics pipeline, right? A connection to the cartels as well sometimes, and so it's changed a lot. But there's still plenty of vets. There are people that were special mission unit operators that are in these clubs. There's support clubs that are vet clubs from the special operations world. Um, it's very heavily influenced by that. And they also recruit very heavily from people getting out of the military because they have skills that they can use.
Yeah.
And so, you know, infiltrating any organization, one of the things that you want to do is say, I can contribute here. I'll be a value add to you guys. And people will overlook a lot if they really want whatever skill you're going to bring. And so, vets are the most likely people to have the skills that these organizations need to further their goals.
Well, a couple of things. And so I agree with you that they do have a military influence because they have row captains and lieutenants. And I mean, they have a rank structure, which is, oddly enough, they use military officers as some of their titles. So,
Yeah.
but so I'm a huge fan of Sons of Anarchy. Whenever it came out, I watched every episode of it and loved it. Realistic, not realistic.
Well, so the first thing a lot of people don't know about Sons of Anarchy is a lot of the actors were in one percenter clubs. Um,
I
and
did.
the episodes are consulted by one club started it and then another one took over. Um, and I think there's been 10 actors in it that were full patched one percenters at one point
Oh,
who are the actors in it. It's it's a little more intense consistently than I think the real world is, but just like in what we did for a living, it doesn't make good episodes if you have to watch the 90% of boredom in our world, and so
right.
that's and that's how that world
Yeah.
is too. It's
Fair
very,
enough.
especially in the one percenter world, people don't mess with them. They don't very often have to do stuff like that unless it's a gang on gang kind of thing. But they earn their reputation, and that's why they wear things. Unlike, let's say, the Italian organized crime thing, they wear it because they know it deters aggression, and it's a way to keep
Yep.
things from happening. But when things happen, it goes from 0 to 100 very very quickly. Um, and so I would say for the show, real life in that world is slower paced, but much more violent when it actually happens.
Yeah, and I think the last major incident that I heard of was at Twin Peaks in Texas, and
Mhm.
I believe there were two rival gangs. They were all, in contact with each other at Twin Peaks, and something kicked it off. And next thing you know, I mean, there's guns. They're doing a shootout. It was nuts. I think that was what, probably 7 or 8 years ago.
2015, I believe, is when that happened.
I think.
Um, right. So I'm very familiar with the circumstances of this. That happened, down in Texas and Waco, and it was over the Texas. Texas has a motorcycle club organization, and this was between a one percenter club, their support clubs, and a three-piece patch club, and they came out in force. There were hundreds of bikers at this thing, and um, there was a confrontation in the parking lot that kicked it off. And one of the things in that world is you don't have to be the one to start a fight, but when it happens, if you're there with other members of the group, if you're with your brothers, you do have to get involved in it. That is that's a dichotomous black and white issue. If something happens,
Yeah.
you're involved. And so that happened between two people in the parking lot as somebody was pulling up, who was a high ranking member of the One Percenter Club. And everybody else just was essentially forced to join in. And because there were so many people, um, it essentially compounded because of that. And I believe there were 220 felony counts that were charged after this incident. And it's worth noting that all of them were dropped later. Nobody went to prison for that. So
Very interesting. I'm sure there's a story behind that.
well, I think that the prosecution was acting unethically. There was some footage that was collected from a phone, as far as I know,
Oh,
that
yes.
showed one of the members of one of the clubs essentially having a private moment with their spouse, and it was passed around uh, the district attorney's office. And I know that the defense team became aware of this, um, and that was part of the reason that it was thrown out.
When we were all starting out, we didn't have some master class in, hey, here are the types of things that could hem you up in your career. Don't pass around private moments. And maybe somebody said it, but they said it along with 100 other things that seem like common sense. They don't necessarily really sink in until you see it the first time. And it, I wonder if the organizational culture you happen to be in at any given point in time can have an influence on some people where they think, oh, I guess this is just how it works. I'm a new person. These are experienced people. I guess this is okay, right? Um, for those of us on this in this conversation, we survived all of that. You know, we had the intestinal fortitude to say, I'm not okay with that if it happened. I've had to say that a few times. I'm sure you have too. But think about all the people trying to get started and like getting caught in that ethical dilemma where they're now working for a team that is more experienced than them, more special than them, and they're supposed to be learning from these special people, and that's what's happening, you know, and the
Yeah.
consequences.
You know what I found really interesting was, because that wasn't the only organized crime group that I did this type of thing with, but they were better at policing these kind of things than I think the IC is internally. Um, they're very, very sensitive to things that could become bigger issues for them down the road. And I'll give you an example. So there was another person in the organization who was a methamphetamine dealer and had a family. I think he had five kids. And I used to watch his kids while he would go out and do these meth sales. And he got a little high on his own supply quite a bit and ended up not making money. And I was always, as a side note, it was always fascinating to me, being the money guy, sitting there with somebody that, is just breaking a law that they're going to go to prison for 20 years if they get caught doing this. And they're like sitting there drinking. They get a call. It's like, hey, can you sell me 2 grams, 30 minutes away? And then they finish their drink. They drive all the way there. Then they do, 2 rails with this person for free. And then they come all the way back. And I was like, man, I think with gas money and you sitting here like buying drinks, you're losing money at something that could put you in prison for two
Oh my
dimes,
gosh.
my man. So um, sometimes that wasn't very thought out. And especially in the narcotics game, if you don't make money selling dope at a low level. The That's very much a pyramid scheme where the money's at the top. And so that always kind of fascinated me a little bit, the risk tolerance that some people had. I'm like, you could make more money working at McDonald's, you know?
Well,
Well,
nobody
that
wants
was,
to work at McDonald's,
yeah,
right?
no, yeah, chance to be on winners, but that's kind of what your deal was, right? So you were the finance guys, get your street cred built up, and the money was flowing through you, and you were accounting for it and giving them advice and that sort of thing, right? To lead them into the right direction so that the organization is making money.
That's it. That was my value. That's why I was what they call in that world fast tracked into it, was because I could demonstrate that value to the organization. And going back a little bit to an overlap between the money and them policing themselves, I had loaned this guy $750. because he was in debt. And I didn't think it was a big deal. And we showed up to, our Thursday night meeting, which they call church in that world. And I got called out because somebody found out about it. And I got taken aside and chewed into by the leadership of the club. And they said, "Did you, give this guy money?" I couldn't tell if this was a loyalty test at first. Like, I'm not supposed to rat this dude out, or and the guy that brought me in saw that I was having this little dilemma over it. And he said, "This is a loyalty test, but this is the test to the club, not to the member." He's like, "Answer the question." And in that world, so much unlike the recruitment side of intelligence, you talk straight to people. If you
Yeah.
are roundabout, people think you're full of it. And so I answered. I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Did he pay it back yet?" It had been over a couple of weeks. And I said, "No, not yet." And he was severely disciplined by the organization for that. And they did that, and they explained it to me later that, look, these issues can grow into bigger issues. And that's how tightly they policed their stuff of, we don't want this to snowball. We don't want the domino effects from something like this, let alone like a real issue. The other thing that they did was, when you would come in, you had to put your cell phone in a basket, and they would Select these phones. They would look and see what's on it. They had, sophisticated SIGINT capabilities themselves, and especially at a cartel level. I mean, these people can play the game the same way that we do. And so that was interesting for me, having started in SIGINT, watching them look for me the way that I was looking for people in Afghanistan. But very interesting.
So I'm assuming that you didn't loan him $750 out of your own pocket, so that came out of the organization's funds. Is that
Uh, no, actually, it was out of my own pocket.
oh wow.
Yeah, I don't know if I could have justified that to the organization. And one of the things about moving money is there's a lot of ways to make money while you're moving money. And so we were able to essentially self finance our ops because of how much money we were making at the same time. And one of the things that at that time was becoming big was Bitcoin, for money laundering. And it's something, I think, that when we first started using it to move money, it was $300 a coin. It's like 75,000 a coin now.
Yeah.
And um, we were making so much money during the time period where we held it in cryptocurrency, when that was the form of the money, that there was no government mechanism, and you could probably relate to this, to re-ingest it. There was just no process to re-ingest the money. And so we just used it as like a rolling op fund, essentially.
Perfect. I love it.
Yeah.
And an op fund isn't a new idea. When you're doing clandestine operations, whether it's offensive counterintelligence operations or it's offensive human collection operations, whatever it is, you need op funds. I mean, you need money to fund everybody's ability to move where they need to move, and their ability to communicate securely, to buy the right things, to look the part, whatever part they're playing. It's expensive. You've got to hire people that are access agents to let you in certain places, or to give you access to certain databases and files, and to tweak certain records sometimes. And all of that stuff costs money. So when you
I
think
mean, even
about
just the
needing an op
logistics
fund,
network,
yeah, it costs
um,
money.
it, to sustain it. And if you're going to show up and say, "Hey, I can move $50 million," I mean, the network that you have to have in place to move that money quickly and pay it out discreetly is overwhelming if people knew what that would take. It's extremely complicated, and it's a system that needs fed whether money's moving through it or not. If money's not
Yeah.
moving through it, it becomes obvious. you know, Consistency in that is the game, right?
Yeah.
And you can only upscale something by a certain percentage. So if you say like an old school way, like a cash based business, like a bar, if you're going to move money through it, you can only tick it up 5, 8% from what it was doing before. It can't become the best bar in the world overnight. That's extreme. That's a red flashing light to law
Hmm.
enforcement or the opposition to look at that. And so the business has to do well to support it also. And that business has to be working 24/7,
Yeah.
doing the legit stuff, not the just the fun stuff most of the time.
And so you mentioned Celex, you've mentioned a few things. And so it sounds like may have not have been organized, but even the criminal organization had a counterintelligence program. And they were serious about their counterintelligence procedures and processes. Now, inside the organization itself, was there like a designated head of counterintelligence for the organization that managed that whole thing, and how was that person viewed by the peers?
Yes, and in several ways. So traditionally, in a club, the sergeant at arms is in charge of security for the chapter. Um, then you have national and international chapter above that. They had people that were former counterintelligence people in the military that were in these organizations. So they weren't just making this stuff up off the top of their head. And they also used people, it depends on what club it is, but they have what's called nomad chapter, where they're not assigned to a specific area. That's like the rover. This is usually a very elite chapter in that world. And those people get a lot of respect. Um, and they also outsource some of this. There are PIs that work for these organizations. I know the one that I was in, one of the members was dating a girl who was a bureau analyst on the organized crime task force. And they were getting information straight from that organization about essentially targeting packages on members of rival in a rival club from the bureau, which they were not aware of at the time. But
I'm assuming that's been sorted out.
I have no idea. I have no idea. It wasn't something that we highlighted at the time, but it might still be in place. I don't know.
I mean, is that something that potentially would spark an FBI internal investigation if they were watching our podcast?
I would hope so.
Is that something you're
hint,
hoping will
hint,
spark
hint.
an internal?
Yeah, hint, hint. Um, yeah, it was amazing to me that this was a situation they were unaware of at the time. But it's not the direction that their program was looking in. And that I
Okay,
think
fair enough.
highlights how easy it can be to penetrate something from an angle that isn't the angle the defense is looking for you to come at.
Beautiful. All right. And so where does it go from here? So how long did you were you in this world, and then where did it lead to next?
About 3.5 years, I was doing that. And then we were looking for a way out about 2 years into it. Just because the I was moving up in rank in it in that world. Um, Essentially, we were a victim of our own success, and it was just
Yeah.
taking too much time. This was supposed to be bona fides, not a 28-hour a day job to pay attention. And
Yeah.
in that world, you're constantly on call. If I got a call at 3 in the morning and a member was like, "Hey, I'm sitting in a bar, some other people walked in, this might go bad," get up, you get in the car or you get on your bike and you show up as fast as possible. And so it was a little too intense attention wise for us to be able to do the main thing, which was, buying foreign military technology or placing money for our own stuff overseas. And so there was an opportunity to get out, which we jumped on, and I left on good terms with that organization and went back to pursuing this. And then the rest of my career with that was mostly penetrating foreign defense contractors that were doing classified work for the opposition, to our country. And so that became much easier all of a sudden after I had been in that world. It was much more of a soft target compared to dealing with them.
From a security, like a personal, physical security uh, frame of mind, right? I mean, so you didn't have to worry about waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, not knowing what you're going to get into once you arrived
Right.
on the scene. Okay.
Right. So one of the stories from the first world was the club I was a part of split. There was a huge fracture, and I went with the smaller group. And one night we were hanging out at a bar, me and four other people, and all of a sudden, about 40 people from the former organization showed up. And this is 1 o'clock in the morning, and the guys around the table are hugging each other, saying, like, I love you, brother. It's been real, like, I'm like, whoa, like, are we prepping to get shot in the face here? Or like, what's going to happen? And the guy who was my mentor in that world looked at me and he said, when these guys come in, don't go to the bathroom. If you have to, just do it sitting here. Don't stand up. Don't engage. Don't be the first one to engage. And this lasted for hours. They were trying to provoke a response from us at the time. And one of the things to look for in that world is these guys are professionals at this. And so the people who aren't drinking alcohol are the ones you got to look out for. So the 10 dudes that are drinking Coca-Colas and waters at the bar, once everybody fades away, those usually happen to be the only guys that stick around afterwards, and things get very intense at that point. But I think one thing that law enforcement underestimates about these people is they do this for a living, and the dumb ones are in prison. And so the transition from that, when I'm talking to a salesman for, let's say, I don't know, North Korea's version of Raytheon, trying to buy something I shouldn't buy, it's not easier, but it's definitely less intense the whole time. And I only have to call him during business hours. And so it did change to be softer in that way. But I learned a lot from those guys about how to handle and fade somebody off. And so, Dave, we talked about this the other day. We had one operation where we were trying to get this clear defense contractor from an opposition country to sell us something that they shouldn't. And I'm talking to the sales rep, and he's saying, like, look, I don't know if I can do this. And we had already done a profile, like a psych profile on this sales rep. We knew he was hard up for it. He needed the money. And we knew he had a bad relationship with his boss. And so I was playing a middleman as the buyer for an unknown destination that this tech was going to go to. And before he had a chance to say it, I'm flashing, man, the guy I'm working for doing this. And I just say everything bad about this guy's boss to him, right, to build that rapport. And it turned out that instead of enforcing the security wickets, he ended up coaching me how to get around them to buy this thing. And he said, look, if we sell it directly, there's all these security wickets that I don't think we're going to get through. But if I set you up as a reseller for our product, they don't exist. And you can resell it to one person, which is you. So, do you have another LLC that we could bring on board as a reseller for our stuff? And I said, as it happens, I do. I do have a LLC that we could use for this. And he essentially coached me through hurting his company from the inside.
Because you built rapport and
Mhm.
and not in the schoolhouse kind of way, buddy, more like
Yeah.
finding that common interest. And the common interest was you had a shitty boss. At least that was your story. He had a shitty
Mhm.
boss. You're stressed not because of anything that matters to you except for your shitty boss. And everybody
Right.
understands being stressed because of a shitty boss.
Right. Right. And it allows you, if there's an anger there, it allows you to express it at somebody else, right? Not him directly, but in a way that kind of scares him a little bit. Like, I don't want this person to feel that way about me. And so you can be aggressive in an indirect way. And it really deterred him from asking pointed questions to me. Um, it deterred him from a lot of things I didn't want to happen in my position. Because I basically would say, I don't like people that treat me this way. And he was like, oh, I'm not going to treat you that way then.
Yeah. But couched in a way that the target of your animosity was not this person, right? Or his organization at all. It was just your boss.
Right. Completely the
And
opposite, you know?
yeah, it's sharp. I imagine you had to think on your feet and just come up with this stuff on the fly, right? On a lot of occasions, or did you feel like everything was an O plan that was carefully constructed in some back office somewhere, right?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a double edged sword. I think as a professional, if you haven't thought out how the conversation's going to go and you end up to it, that's a fail, especially working in cover. So you're constantly thinking, before I have this 2-minute phone call, you might spend 10 hours thinking, what if he says this? What if he says that? What if he asks this? What if he asks that? And so if you're surprised, I think it's because you're not doing your job right. Did it happen? Yes. But should it happen in a perfect world in my position? Never.
But I think we see that I've seen it a lot in the counterintelligence field. It's that people get, almost too much ego, and they shy away from doing the basics like role playing, talking it out, planning, coming up with a meeting plan with objectives and that sort of things. And so you see them not be as successful as others. And in the cover world, it adds another layer of complexity to it because it's who am I? What am I doing here? And it doesn't make sense. And so I think you have to really take the time to plan this whole thing out.
And the more you do, the better it is. I think one of the best tricks that we used was embedding memory. So if I'm going to tell a story about the time I was at the Eiffel Tower and did this, go there and do it. Let your brain process that it has actually happened to you. It's not just a thought. And it's easier to recall in detail after that. It's easier to be consistent because it did happen.
So, were you taught that by your mentors at the agency, or is that something you learned based on your interactions with FCA?
That was at the agency that we did that.
Yeah,
Um,
gotcha.
and that was, I would be taken to places. They would stage stuff with people to allow this embedding to happen. It was something I wasn't familiar with before, but
Gotcha.
maybe one of the most effective psychological tricks that we use, because you never know the detail that you're missing until you see it, for real. So and you have to be able to extrapolate from the story that you're given to be good at this. So one of the tests that we use, like in training people for this, is to say, think of a new name, just a first name. Think of your mother's maiden name that's not real, and the year you were born. You can give somebody 10 minutes to memorize these three pieces of information. And the way that you drive this home in training is they're coming in and they're thinking, oh my goodness, I got to remember these. I'm going to be really good at this. And you say, what's your name? What year were you born? What's your mother's maiden name? You go faster. What year were you born? What's your mother's maiden name? What's your name? Back and forth, back and forth. And they get in this pace of answering a certain amount of time from the question. And you say, how old are you? And then they have to go, oh, I didn't think of that, And one of the things that these memory embedding things can do is point out to you, wow, I'm actually standing here. What's around it? It's not just the Eiffel Tower. There are things around it, Is it on a river? Is it not? Is there a hot dog stand that's been there for 30 years next to it? Or is there not? And I think from, the corporate side, right? Like when there's been these news stories of North Korea trying to get into corporate America, doing these phone calls, right? Like a Skype call or a phone call to interview for a job. And
Sure.
they say they live in California, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't. They're in North Korea. And I think one of the things that corporate America can do from an HR perspective to be more CI aware is ask people details about their situation through the veil of kindness and pretending to care, and say something like, wow, I've always wanted to live in California. I've heard it's gorgeous. What's the weather like there today? It might be storming. It might be sunny. I doubt that North Korean person doing the interview thought to look that up. But people who are very good at this, they know all those things ahead of time.
And there's a whole matter of pocket litter too. I mean, and so you're going around, like you said, in Paris, and you're visiting the hot dog stand, and you're buying a hot dog and getting a receipt, and you're getting a business card and a book of matches, and all of these things tell a story as well. So it's not just the things that are coming out of your mouth. I mean, it's all of it in totality that really brings a cover together.
Yes. And does it make sense?
Yeah.
Let's take Paris. Well, who are you there with? No, I went on a romantic trip by myself to see the Eiffel Tower. It's less believable than I was there with somebody else. But now that person needs to exist. They have to be a real person that has a name that can be looked up, that can be found on Facebook. And whenever you introduce these things into the room, they have to be legitimate, or it's very easy to poke holes in the lie.
There has to be enough truth there that you can respond spontaneously. Um, I personally, on the defensive counterintelligence side, I've had a lot of training on how to determine if someone's being truthful or not, or do they intend to be truthful.
Yep.
And analyzing statements, are they indicative of a truthful person, like things a truthful person would say if provoked a little, or are they indicative of things an untruthful person would say? And usually it's fairly easy to determine if someone's going to be truthful with you or not, or if what they're saying is true or not. In your experience, how have you dealt with the dilemmas associated with lying? Has it been something that you were trained to do and you were good at, or you weren't trained to do and you figured out? Or like, where did you land on the general scale of, is it useful or not to lie, or is it better to try to be as honest as possible?
Well, I mean, it's always better to be honest. One of the things that I was trained into was to not overshare. There's a difference between answering somebody's question legalistically and directly, and assuming what they want to get out of you and giving that to them instead. And so for me, being on the other side of the table from somebody in both of your career field, you got to ask me the right question, or I'm just going to tell the truth. It's not going to speak to the intent of your question, but I can tell the truth without lying and without compromising myself, unless the question is crafted the right way. And so, in the world that I worked in, people were really natural lie detectors because they had to be. They were switched on since children, because of the violence, because of a lot of things. They could tell what bullshit was pretty easily, but they were not skilled interviewers, and they didn't know how to craft a question skillfully. And so I don't think I lied that often, to be honest.
So they're great bullshit detectors, but not necessarily great at crafting the right question based on all of the context involved, right?
Right. And also, if you're in my position or you're trying to gain entree into a group or do
Mm-hmm.
something like an infiltration, you don't let yourself sit there and be quizzed like you're on a game show the entire time. Right. That's one of the biggest things that I was taught was you use the social graces to make people feel rude for asking you the things you don't want to answer. This isn't 20 questions. And so if you do your job right, people don't ask you the things that you don't want to get asked. They would think it would offend you to do so. And if you're not actively doing that, you end up in those spots. And I have a couple of times I've been asked direct questions that I looked back and said, if I would have prepped this environment socially a little bit better, that guy would have never asked me that question. So,
Yep.
yeah, do
That could
you
be a
have to
lesson
lie?
for case officers out there. When we're talking about case officers responsible for a real person that's on the inside, how do we help them think about all those scenarios and think through them in ways that they can kind of take control of their own environment.
Mhm.
You can set things in motion that are preventative. Um,
You don't want to be reactionary in that world. You want to
yeah,
be the stimulus. You want
yeah,
all the balls to be bouncing off each other and the ripples to happen because you're the rock that goes into the pond, not the waves that are getting hit by it. And so you have to, and it's hard when you're living a life like that where you're expected to consume tons of alcohol in a day or whatever, to stay switched on in a way that you're affecting what's going on around you instead of being affected by what's going on around you. And one of the other things is, I wasn't there to be a part of, people murdering people. And so that would have been an op fail to I would have had to be pulled out if somebody got shot in the face, next to me. And so a lot of what I was doing was trying to calm the horse down around me and keep violent situations from happening without them noticing. And why is this guy always the one saying, let's not go get into it with people? And so you have to do that very subtly as well. But you have to be very energy sensitive to the people around you to do something like that. And to me, the best way to do that is to be genuine and make real relationships with people that are genuine to where they think you care because you do about them, and they'll be responsive to things like that. But if you're just trying to be Mr. Tough Guy the whole time, that's this hard person, you can't evoke that kind of positive emotion that you might need to be in the room off of somebody.
absolutely. I think you touched on something that is at the heart of this whole conversation, and that's that you needed to develop real relationships inside of a group of individuals that American society at least considers to be on the criminal fringes of society, right?
Mhm.
And you needed to figure out ways to relate to them. And as it turns out, a lot of them are veterans.
Mhm.
Um, it seems to me that when you're working with combat vets that are coming out of special forces, DevGru, JSOC, um, counterintelligence,
Mhm.
all of infantry, whether it's Marines or Army infantry, Rangers, all these different combat troopers that get out and have trouble reintegrating, and
Right.
they end up in one of these groups, maybe not
Yep.
knowing exactly what they're getting into at first, but they just kind of assimilate into it and make sense to them more than getting a job at McDonald's, which, as you said earlier, might pay more. Um, was I mean, to me, like, I, it's hard for me to think about what vets go through
Mhm.
in a bad way. Like, whatever a vet, however they lash out, wherever they end up based on their trauma, to me, like, kind of makes sense. And it might not be okay legally. It might not be okay in the normal sort of society that we all think exists. But to them, that normal society isn't relevant anymore after combat.
Right.
And they find themselves unable to participate in the trap of suburban life, the debt trap, trying to imagine coming back with nothing. You went to war, you came back with nothing but trauma.
Mhm.
You have no money. You might have a free ticket to education, but you've got nowhere to live. Um,
Yep.
you don't have a car. You've got no family. I'm not saying this is everybody. I'm just thinking about certain people that find themselves trapped,
Yep.
and they're looking for help, and they go to their veteran associations, their veteran friends, the people they deployed with. Hey, I'm in a group. We'll take care
And
of
it's
you. Come
just
on,
like
let's
that.
go.
You're missing the brotherhood. Come over here. It's just like it was downrange. Is what people are hearing, and I've had this was something that was very emotional for me when I was there. It's one of the reasons I didn't want to testify, other than, I mean, there were a myriad of reasons, but one of them was, do I think people who do criminal things should get prosecuted for it? Sure. Do I want to necessarily be the person doing it when it's a vet? Not personally. I didn't want to. Um, but there was always this tug for me of, I've shed tears with some of those vets in it over stuff that happened downrange. That was genuine. That was just us being two people that had served together. And then did it make that person trust me more? Probably after that. And so um, that didn't feel super great to know that, was I doing it because I cared, or was I doing it to further the job? Became a little blurred for a while.
Did you? I mean, you had to contextualize that in the moment, and you're out now. Um, Looking back, do you feel like there's a message for our vets that are in these groups? Is there a different way? Maybe not. I mean, they people kind of find themselves where they end up a lot of times,
Mhm.
especially as vets, winding up in biker gangs that are involved in international criminal sort of enterprises.
Well, there's a line. There are people that go there on purpose to get access to the criminal stuff. You can't say, well, I'm just here because I'm really, messed up over my tour of duty. and I'm making $30 million a year moving metric tons of cocaine. Like that doesn't jive completely. And so I think that as a culture, we have to do better about giving other options to the people that are there for that reason. People that want to be criminals are going to be criminals. But there's people there that are there for the camaraderie, for the brotherhood, for the love, and they get lumped into it. But it's because they feel there's no other option. And I don't think it's something that they need to solve. I think it's something that we need to solve for them and say, here's another way that isn't, I don't know, that isn't sarcastic or disingenuine, as a way that they can, find a sense of self later. But also, you see these news stories where, MOIS, IRGC has been hiring people from this world to do political assassinations and hits and stuff like that. And I think that when I look at a club that's doing something like that, I think, where are all the vets in the club telling leadership, hey, look, if we're going to do all this stuff, fine. But working with a group like Iran, no. And so I think that they have a responsibility in that world to step up and say, we're not gonna do this, and police themselves a little bit more.
Is that
than
a
they
safety
are right
problem for our vets that are put in those dilemmas? Are they able to stand up and say that?
You're able to stand up and say whatever you want in that world. You get a voice. Whether or not people are going to listen to you, that's contingent, and it's something that causes internal fighting in those organizations. So if you look at the Iran thing, go ahead.
That's the same anywhere, right?
Mhm.
That's not unique to the criminal underground. That's the same in corporate America. You get a voice, but that doesn't mean people are going to listen to you, right?
Right.
Interesting. Okay,
And
sorry I interrupted you there.
No, and it's shifted a bit. So the Iran thing, if you look at the news stories, they're saying this person was paid $300,000 in a cryptocurrency by some IRGC officer to do this hit. The club would not tolerate something that's that off-brand for one member to get 300 grand. That's nothing to them. And so you have to think, what is it that they're willing to tolerate a relationship that looks so off-brand, right? This is an American motorcycle club that wears the flag, freedom and Leonard Skinner, kind of vibe. That's their marketing campaign. Iran doesn't fit into that brand very well. So what must it be? It must be that Iran is opening a narcotics pipeline for them, probably based on the heroin trade, to make it worth the risk for them to be so off-brand.
Like based on the Western or the Eastern Iran, Western Afghanistan poppy fields.
Bingo. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
Moneymaker.
Right. And, you wouldn't think that a bunch of people who are historically white supremacists, right? People that were wearing swastikas on their stuff historically would be bedfellows with Iran. But, what's changed since the 1960s is the only color is green.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this conversation in episode 14.
Thank you for listening to UnIntelligence, the corporate counterintelligence podcast. The thoughts and opinions, along with any mistakes made during live sessions, are our own. We represent no corporate or government agencies. And if interested, we invite you to join the conversation as we seek to turn over stones and shed light on the counterintelligence mindset and its applications in the places we all work. And we're always open to feedback, so we make sure to speak to the topics you're interested in.
So keep the comments and likes flowing. Until next time, stay safe and secure and report concerns to security professionals.